The funeral hall smelled faintly of lilies and incense, a quiet stillness broken only by the soft murmur of grieving relatives. Jonathan Reid stood at the back, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, the polished black suit he wore feeling heavier than it should. He had chosen it carefully, not for show, but because it had been his mother's favorite, a subtle nod to her memory, a way of honoring her with dignity. But then he heard it. A whisper, laced with amusement, cutting through the somber atmosphere like a shard of ice. "Look at him. Wearing that? Does he even know how outdated that is?" Jonathan froze, recognizing the voice immediately. It was Vanessa, his cousin, always sharp with words, quick with judgment, and never one to hide her sense of superiority. She laughed softly, nudging her friend beside her, whose smirk confirmed the insult. The words stung far more than Jonathan expected, not because they were cruel, but because they came at a moment of grief, a sacred space for mourning. To mock him here, at his mother's funeral, felt like a betrayal amplified 100-fold. Jonathan's heart thumped painfully. He looked around, searching for some sign that others had heard, some hint that anyone might intervene. But the whispers were subtle, almost polite in tone, and no one seemed to notice. And yet, Jonathan noticed. Every ounce of restraint he had cultivated in life crumbled in that moment. The grief that had anchored him, the mourning that had kept him silent, now mixed with a burning desire to respond, not out loud, not angrily, but in a way that would leave its mark. He excused himself quietly, retreating to the hallway where the air was colder, sharper. His mind raced. How could someone be so callous, so oblivious to the sanctity of grief? How could Vanessa, someone he had once considered family, wield words like weapons at the most vulnerable moment of his life? The thought of retaliation, subtle, precise, impactful, began to take shape. He didn't want to confront her directly here. Not in front of mourners, not in a hall filled with grief. But later. Yes, later, when the context allowed, he could make a statement, reveal a truth that would leave its impression without stooping to open hostility. Jonathan's inner conflict grew over the next few days. He was consumed by a mix of grief and anger, each feeding the other. He remembered every small slight Vanessa had inflicted over the years, the casual dismissals, the cutting remarks about his achievements, the implied superiority that always hung in her tone. But this was different. Mockery at his mother's funeral was an act that could not be brushed aside. It demanded acknowledgement, some form of justice, if only to restore a sense of personal dignity. Yet even as the desire for revenge grew, Jonathan grappled with morality. He had always believed in measured responses, in restraint. He didn't want to be cruel, and he certainly didn't want to diminish the memory of his mother or the sanctity of mourning. But the seed of subtle retribution had been planted, and it grew quietly, persistently, in the fertile ground of his hurt and humiliation. He began to think strategically. What form could revenge take that would be impactful yet not harmful, subtle yet undeniable? Jonathan realized that the most potent weapon wasn't confrontation, it was truth. A revelation, timed and delivered precisely, could achieve what open conflict could not, a lasting impression, an acknowledgement of his own success, his value, and a quiet but undeniable reminder of the consequences of underestimating him. And so, with a mixture of grief, anger, and the faint thrill of plotting, Jonathan began to lay the groundwork. He would not act impulsively. Each step would be calculated, every detail deliberate. He would wait for the right moment, ensuring maximum impact without crossing the line into malice. The process itself became a focus, a channel for his swirling emotions, a way to regain control in a life momentarily upended by loss. For Jonathan, this was more than revenge. It was a reclamation of dignity, a quiet assertion of self-respect, and a testament to the principle that actions, even small, careless words, carry weight. The desire to respond, to reveal a truth that had long been overlooked, was no longer optional. It had become a necessity, not for anger, not for humiliation, but for balance, recognition, and the preservation of personal integrity. By the time the funeral arrangements had been cleared, Jonathan had made a silent vow. He would reveal his truth in a way that commanded attention, that could not be ignored, and that would leave a subtle but undeniable mark on Vanessa's understanding. And as he stepped out into the cool afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the quiet cemetery, he felt the stirrings of a plan that would unfold not in rash confrontation, but in precise, deliberate revelation, a demonstration of value, power, and the consequences of thoughtless mockery. In the days following the funeral, Jonathan Reid found himself walking a tightrope of conflicting emotions. Every memory of Vanessa's smirk, the hushed whisper that had cut through the somber air, replayed relentlessly in his mind. It wasn't just her words, it was the timing, the audacity of mocking him at a moment of deep personal loss. Each replay left him angrier, yet beneath the anger, an even more complicated feeling emerged, a desire for justice, for acknowledgement, for a subtle demonstration of his own worth. Jonathan's life had not always been public, nor had he sought attention for personal gain. He had worked quietly for years, building a reputation in the business world that few outside his immediate circle truly understood. His mother had been proud of him, yet protective of the private nature of his achievements. Now, confronted with Vanessa's mockery, he realized that the world needed to see the truth, not out of cruelty, but as a reminder that assumptions, arrogance, and thoughtless judgments have consequences. The idea of revenge came slowly, carefully. Jonathan knew he did not want to humiliate Vanessa publicly in a way that would reflect poorly on himself. There would be no shouting matches, no social media callouts, no overt confrontation. Instead, he envisioned a measured, impactful revelation, a quiet display of success and self-worth that would speak volumes without saying a word of direct accusation. The plan required patience, timing, and the perfect moment when his truth could shine fully, unobstructed by anger or chaos. Yet even as he crafted this strategy, Jonathan wrestled with his conscience. He asked himself repeatedly, was this revenge, or was it simply honesty? Was he driven by anger, or by the need to assert the value of his own life and work? The line between retaliation and affirmation blurred in ways that left him unsettled. He did not want to become someone defined by bitterness, yet he could not ignore the need to respond to the disrespect he had endured. Jonathan began to take notes, writing in a small leather journal that had belonged to his mother. He recorded every detail about Vanessa's words, every memory of past slights, and every subtle insult that had lingered unspoken for years. But alongside these entries, he wrote plans for the revelation itself, how he would present the truth about his brand, the timing, the audience, and the message he wanted to convey. The act of planning became almost therapeutic, a channel for the anger that had no outlet and a framework for transforming hurt into something constructive rather than destructive. He also considered the ethical dimension. Could his revelation be framed in a way that was empowering rather than vengeful? Could he celebrate his achievements without targeting Vanessa personally, allowing her arrogance and assumptions to be corrected by observation rather than confrontation? This moral calculation consumed him. Every scenario was tested in his mind. Revealing too much too soon might appear boastful, revealing too little might leave the impact diluted. The balance between justice and integrity became a guiding principle, shaping every decision he made. Jonathan's family noticed the change in him. His siblings remarked on his quiet intensity, the way he seemed to retreat inward, thinking deeply and speaking sparingly. Even his closest friends sensed that something significant was brewing, though they could not guess what form it would take. Jonathan did not confide in anyone. This was his personal journey, his silent reckoning. The act of planning, of anticipating the moment when the truth would finally emerge, became both a coping mechanism and a source of quiet empowerment. The psychological tension built steadily. Every interaction with Vanessa became a test of self-control. Her casual arrogance, her glances that suggested superiority, her subtle mockery in social gatherings, all fueled the careful strategy forming in Jonathan's mind. Yet he restrained himself, understanding that impulsive action would undermine both the impact and his own integrity. He walked a careful line between patience and anticipation, between restraint and subtle assertiveness. He researched ways to make his brand known without directly challenging Vanessa. He considered launching a limited showcase, timing a public announcement, or arranging a subtle but undeniable demonstration of his success. Each step was calculated to ensure that the revelation would not feel like revenge but rather a natural acknowledgement of accomplishment, a truth that would correct assumptions quietly yet powerfully. The days became a rhythm of anticipation. Jonathan rehearsed mental scenarios endlessly, how Vanessa might react, how friends and family might notice, and how he could maintain composure regardless of the immediate response. He felt a growing sense of control, a shift from the helplessness he had experienced at the funeral to a measured empowerment. His grief remained, but it was now tempered by focus and strategy. He was not acting out of cruelty, he was asserting reality. Even as he planned, Jonathan grappled with fear. What if the revelation caused resentment rather than acknowledgement? What if his subtle demonstration, intended to assert truth and dignity, was interpreted as boastfulness? The internal debate became a crucible, forcing him to examine not only his goals but the kind of person he wanted to be. Could he achieve satisfaction without compromising his values? Could he correct a wrong while preserving integrity? Over the next weeks, Jonathan meticulously prepared. Contracts were finalized, presentations crafted, and timing perfected. He coordinated his actions with precision, ensuring that the eventual revelation would occur naturally, without manipulation, confrontation, or malice. The psychological weight of preparation became a meditation in itself, patience, planning, and moral clarity intertwined to form the foundation for the decisive moment. By the time the opportunity arrived, a casual gathering, a moment when Vanessa would be present, yet unprepared for the revelation, Jonathan was ready. He felt the familiar knot of tension in his chest, a mixture of anticipation, anxiety, and subdued triumph. The months of grief, reflection, and careful planning had led to this moment. The stage was set, the audience unknowingly assembled, and the truth of his brand poised to speak for itself. Jonathan took a deep breath, steadying his resolve. He reminded himself of the principles that had guided him through the planning process: honesty, dignity, and subtlety. This was not about revenge in the conventional sense, it was about reclaiming his worth, asserting reality, and allowing the consequences of arrogance to unfold naturally. And as Vanessa approached, chatting casually with others, Jonathan felt a quiet thrill. The moment had arrived. The truth would be revealed, precise, undeniable, and impactful, and he would watch, not with malice, but with a sense of calm satisfaction, knowing that integrity and patience had carried him to the culmination of his carefully plotted plan. The evening had settled into a quiet hum of conversation, soft laughter, and the clinking of glasses. The gathering Jonathan had chosen was intimate, consisting of friends, family, and acquaintances, enough people to make the revelation undeniable, yet private enough to avoid unnecessary spectacle. Vanessa arrived fashionably late, as always, exuding the same air of casual superiority that had marked her for years. Her eyes immediately sought familiar faces, scanning for admiration, approval, and perhaps the subtle validation she thrived on. Jonathan stood near the refreshments, his posture calm, his expression measured. He had rehearsed this moment countless times in his mind, every detail considered: how to approach, how to speak, and how to deliver the subtle yet undeniable statement of his accomplishments. His heart beat steadily, a mixture of anticipation, anxiety, and quiet triumph. Every fiber of his being was focused, honed to a single purpose: to reveal the truth, reclaim dignity, and allow Vanessa's arrogance to meet the consequences of its assumptions. As Vanessa approached, Jonathan greeted her with a polite nod. The casual warmth in his voice belied the intensity of the moment. "Vanessa, good to see you," he said smoothly, masking the undercurrent of tension with practiced ease. She smiled, a little too self-assuredly, as if she were already prepared to dismiss whatever he had to say. The room was filled with people engaged in conversation, oblivious to the tension simmering just beneath the surface. Jonathan knew this was his opportunity, a perfect stage to assert his truth without theatrics. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of every previous insult, every hushed mocking whisper, every cutting remark that had lingered in his mind. And then, with measured confidence, he began. "You know," Jonathan started casually, as if remarking on the weather, "I've been quietly working on something for years. Something that took a lot of effort, patience, and dedication. It's a project I've poured my heart into, and it's finally ready to be shared." He paused, letting the statement hang in the air, watching Vanessa's expression shift imperceptibly. Curiosity, a flicker of doubt, and a momentary hesitation crossed her features. From his pocket, Jonathan pulled a small tablet, connected to a discreet presentation that he had prepared. Images and brief descriptions of his brand, elegant, successful, and undeniably impactful, began to appear. The display was subtle but commanding, the kind of work that spoke for itself, leaving no room for underestimation or dismissal. He did not shout, he did not boast, he simply allowed the truth to be seen, every detail meticulously crafted to reflect years of quiet achievement. Vanessa's smirk faltered almost immediately. Her eyes widened slightly as she absorbed the presentation, and for the first time, Jonathan noticed the shift in her demeanor. The casual arrogance, the superiority she had wielded so effortlessly at his mother's funeral, gave way to a mixture of surprise, embarrassment, and reluctant acknowledgement. She leaned slightly forward, unable to hide her attention, captivated despite herself by the undeniable success displayed before her. Jonathan continued, his voice calm, deliberate, and free of malice. "This is what I've been working on, Vanessa. I didn't say anything before because it wasn't about impressing others, it was about building something meaningful, something that mattered. But I think it's important that assumptions, judgments, and casual dismissals don't go unchecked. Success isn't always loud, and respect is earned, not assumed." The words carried weight not through anger or aggression, but through their quiet authority. Jonathan had transformed months of humiliation, grief, and contemplation into a demonstration of competence and self-respect. The room, previously filled with chatter, had grown quieter as people paused to observe, the attention now subtly drawn toward the unfolding revelation. Vanessa's reaction was a mixture of disbelief and recognition. She opened her mouth, perhaps to deflect, to excuse her previous behavior, but the words never came. The subtle realization that she had underestimated Jonathan, that she had mocked him at the most vulnerable moment of his life, settled over her like a cold shadow. Her confidence, once so unshakable, now seemed fragile, and the small gestures of her previous superiority felt hollow under the quiet, undeniable truth Jonathan had revealed. For Jonathan, the moment was electrifying yet serene. He did not feel gloating satisfaction, there was no rush of anger, no indulgence in humiliation. Instead, he experienced a calm triumph, a sense of balance restored. The injustice of Vanessa's mockery had met a measured, intelligent response, not cruelty, not vindictive exposure, but a quiet display of self-worth that spoke louder than words ever could. As the minutes passed, the atmosphere in the room shifted. People began to murmur appreciatively, nodding in acknowledgement of the brand's quality, sophistication, and undeniable success. Vanessa remained silent, her previous amusement replaced by introspection. Jonathan observed her closely, seeing in her eyes a flicker of understanding, a recognition that the assumptions she had relied upon were flawed, that judgment without knowledge is perilous, and that subtle arrogance often comes at the cost of overlooked truths. Even as he watched Vanessa process the revelation, Jonathan grappled with the final moral decision. Should he push further, drive the point home more aggressively, or allow the demonstration to speak for itself? Months of planning, reflection, and restraint had taught him that subtlety carries more weight than confrontation. He chose patience, allowing the impact to unfold naturally, trusting the truth to settle in the minds of those present. The revelation completed, Jonathan stepped back, blending into the crowd with a quiet composure that contrasted sharply with the storm of emotions he had contained for so long. Vanessa's posture remained stiff, her hands momentarily clasped as she processed the unexpected demonstration of achievement. The shift was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone not paying close attention, yet it was profound in its effect. The power of mockery had been neutralized not through vengeance, but through truth, integrity, and deliberate action. Jonathan walked away from the display, feeling a mixture of relief and quiet satisfaction. The months of planning, reflection, and moral contemplation had culminated in a moment that achieved everything he intended without causing unnecessary harm. He had restored his dignity, corrected assumptions, and allowed the consequences of thoughtless mockery to emerge naturally. Later, as he reflected privately, Jonathan realized the deeper significance of what had occurred. The temptation for revenge, while powerful, had been channeled into a constructive and morally sound response. He had resisted impulsive reactions, refrained from humiliation, and chosen a path that preserved both his integrity and his emotional balance. In doing so, he discovered that the most impactful form of retribution is not the one that inflicts pain, but the one that demonstrates worth, competence, and resilience in the face of disrespect. Vanessa would likely reflect on the event for weeks, reconsidering not only her assumptions about Jonathan, but also the broader implications of casual judgment and thoughtless mockery. Jonathan, for his part, felt a profound sense of closure. The wound inflicted at his mother's funeral, though still tender, had been acknowledged and addressed with precision, dignity, and moral clarity. The psychological weight of months of grief and anger had transformed into empowerment, balance, and a reinforced sense of personal integrity. And in that quiet satisfaction, Jonathan understood the ultimate lesson. Revenge is not about inflicting pain, it is about restoring balance, asserting truth, and reclaiming dignity. By choosing subtlety, patience, and moral clarity over impulsive retaliation, he had achieved a resolution that was far more powerful than mere retribution ever could be. The evening of the revelation faded into memory, yet its impact lingered like a slow-burning ember in Jonathan Reid's mind. The quiet satisfaction he had felt immediately after presenting his brand had evolved into a more nuanced reflection, a deep exploration of the emotional and psychological layers that had led to this moment. He found himself revisiting each detail, Vanessa's fleeting expressions, the subtle shift in the room, and the unspoken acknowledgement from those who had witnessed the display. Each memory reinforced the understanding that patience, strategic thinking, and moral restraint had produced far greater results than impulsive revenge ever could. Jonathan spent the following days in contemplative solitude, a cup of coffee in hand as he reviewed the responses and conversations that had emerged from the gathering. Friends and acquaintances who had been present remarked on the quality and sophistication of his work, the elegance of his presentation, and the quiet authority with which he carried himself. These acknowledgments, though subtle, carried profound weight. They were not fueled by spectacle or arrogance but by the undeniable evidence of his dedication and competence. In this, Jonathan realized the first lesson of true vindication. Recognition derived from substance far surpasses any temporary satisfaction gained through humiliation or confrontation. Vanessa, meanwhile, seemed transformed, though not in overt ways. She had retreated into her own reflections, navigating the discomfort of realizing she had underestimated Jonathan and, perhaps, allowed pride to cloud her judgment. She avoided direct confrontation, instead observing quietly, processing the implications of the revelation. Jonathan suspected that her pride would make her reluctant to apologize immediately, yet he also recognized that meaningful acknowledgement does not always require words. Actions, behavior, and the quiet hum of understanding often speak louder than a hastily offered excuse. For Jonathan, this was an exercise in emotional intelligence as much as strategic action. The relief he experienced was tempered by introspection, the knowledge that revenge, in its purest sense, is rarely satisfying unless it is executed with integrity and purpose. He considered how easily anger can cloud judgment, how impulses can lead to choices that provide fleeting gratification but lasting regret. By channeling his desire for revenge into a measured, dignified demonstration, he had achieved the dual goal of asserting his worth while preserving his moral compass. The psychological effects of this process were profound. Jonathan noticed a subtle shift in his self-perception. Confidence no longer mingled with resentment, and pride no longer required external validation to feel justified. The process of planning, anticipating, and executing a controlled response had strengthened his sense of autonomy and self-respect. Each step taken with intention reinforced a belief that moral courage and strategic thinking are far more satisfying than impulsive retaliation. Over the next few weeks, Jonathan observed Vanessa navigating social interactions with a subtle change in demeanor. She no longer casually dismissed his achievements. Instead, she exhibited a careful awareness, a cautious respect that was not forced but organically developed from the undeniable truth he had presented. Jonathan refrained from engaging her directly, allowing the natural consequences of perception to unfold. It was a quiet form of triumph, one that required patience, discipline, and emotional maturity, and which yielded far more lasting satisfaction than immediate confrontation ever could. In reflecting on the experience, Jonathan also confronted the deeper question of what had motivated his desire for revenge. It was not mere anger, it was a yearning for acknowledgement, a need to reclaim dignity, and a recognition that hurtful words, when delivered carelessly, leave lasting impressions. By understanding the root of his emotions, he could address them with clarity, purpose, and ethical foresight. This insight allowed him to separate personal vindication from cruelty, creating a response that was both impactful and morally sound. Jonathan's relationships with others were subtly influenced by the event. Friends and colleagues who had been aware of Vanessa's mockery observed his response with quiet admiration, recognizing the restraint, thoughtfulness, and strategic acumen involved. His measured approach became a model for others navigating complex emotional landscapes. That influence is often more effectively wielded through composure and substance than through impulsive retaliation. Even Vanessa herself, while slow to overtly acknowledge the shift, began to show signs of introspection in social settings. Her casual jabs at Jonathan's appearance ceased, replaced by guarded respect and a more considered approach to interaction. The lesson she internalized, though unspoken, reflected the power of subtle, controlled action. One does not need to humiliate or confront to assert authority or achieve recognition. The truth, presented thoughtfully, has a resonance that far outlasts the fleeting satisfaction of anger. Jonathan, meanwhile, continued to build his brand with quiet determination, unshaken by the echoes of past humiliation. The incident at his mother's funeral, once a source of intense emotional turmoil, had transformed into a pivotal moment of personal growth. He now understood that life presents challenges not merely to be endured but to be navigated with integrity, patience, and strategic insight. The moral clarity he gained became a guiding principle in both personal and professional spheres, shaping decisions, interactions, and the broader understanding of human behavior. As time progressed, Jonathan reflected on the broader implications of his actions. Revenge, in its raw form, often perpetuates cycles of conflict, resentment, and emotional strain. By contrast, a measured, morally grounded response can achieve reconciliation, recognition, and personal empowerment without causing unnecessary harm. This understanding provided not only personal closure but also a framework for navigating future conflicts with composure, foresight, and ethical awareness. The aftermath also offered a subtle, enduring satisfaction. Jonathan did not seek to flaunt his achievements publicly. He allowed his work to speak for itself, confident that the impact would be felt in the ways that mattered most. He recognized that true influence comes not from imposing authority or punishing misjudgment, but from embodying competence, integrity, and emotional resilience. By the end of this reflective period, Jonathan felt a profound sense of balance. The pain of mockery and exclusion had been acknowledged, addressed, and transformed into a constructive, empowering experience. He had preserved his dignity, asserted his worth, and allowed the consequences of Vanessa's arrogance to emerge naturally. The emotional weight of the incident had shifted from resentment to empowerment, from reaction to measured, purposeful action. Ultimately, Jonathan realized that revenge is not about inflicting pain, it is about reclaiming one's own narrative, asserting dignity, and allowing truth to be recognized without compromise. The experience strengthened his character, clarified his values, and deepened his understanding of human behavior. Vanessa's mockery, once a source of deep humiliation, had catalyzed a journey of self-reflection, strategic action, and moral triumph. Jonathan's internal transformation became the enduring legacy of the incident. He had confronted grief, insult, and the temptation of revenge with intelligence, restraint, and dignity. In doing so, he discovered a principle far more powerful than vengeance, that personal integrity, patience, and thoughtful action create a resonance and influence that far surpass the fleeting satisfaction of retaliation. And in the quiet reflection that followed, Jonathan felt an unspoken but profound victory, one not marked by confrontation, humiliation, or animosity, but by the quiet, undeniable assertion of self-worth, competence, and moral clarity. The aftermath, though subtle, had achieved exactly what he had intended: a balance restored, dignity reclaimed, and a reminder that truth, patience, and integrity are far more powerful than the impulse for revenge. The weeks that followed Jonathan Reid's revelation at the gathering settled into a rhythm of quiet reflection and subtle transformation. The emotional turbulence that had followed his mother's funeral, which had once left him reeling between grief, anger, and humiliation, now began to feel like a distant storm, replaced by a sense of equilibrium he had not known in months. He carried himself with a calm awareness that only comes from having faced adversity, wrestled with moral dilemmas, and emerged intact. Jonathan observed Vanessa cautiously from afar, noting the small shifts in her demeanor. She no longer delivered casual jabs about appearances or accomplishments. Her interactions were tempered with a newfound awareness, an understanding that words carry consequences, and that subtle arrogance often leads to unintentional exposure. Jonathan did not seek acknowledgement, nor did he desire immediate apology. He had learned that time, experience, and reflection are far more effective teachers than confrontation. Yet, one afternoon, as the sun cast a golden glow over the quiet streets of his neighborhood, Jonathan received a message from Vanessa. It was brief, hesitant, and contained an unexpected vulnerability. "Jonathan, I've been thinking about what you showed us the other night. I realize now that I judged too quickly. I'm sorry for what I said at Mom's funeral. I didn't consider your feelings, and I acted thoughtlessly." The words were simple, yet they carried a profound weight. Jonathan felt a mixture of relief and tenderness. The apology was not forced, nor was it overly dramatic. It was genuine, reflective, and unburdened by ego. It represented a quiet acknowledgement, the kind that comes from introspection rather than coercion. He replied with equal calm, expressing gratitude without dwelling on past pain. "Thank you, Vanessa. I appreciate your honesty. It means more than you might realize." This exchange, brief and understated, was a turning point. Jonathan realized that true closure does not always require grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes, it is the small, sincere acknowledgments, the willingness to reflect, apologize, and listen, that create the deepest, most lasting sense of resolution. In the days that followed, Jonathan noticed subtle shifts in other relationships as well. Friends and family who had witnessed the revelation began to speak differently about assumptions, respect, and the weight of words. The gathering had become more than a platform for personal vindication. It had become a quiet lesson in dignity, patience, and integrity. Jonathan had turned what could have been a moment of anger into an opportunity for reflection and growth, both for himself and for others. Jonathan's own perspective had evolved significantly. The grief of losing his mother, compounded by the humiliation at her funeral, had initially fueled a desire for revenge, a need to assert himself in the face of thoughtless mockery. Yet through careful planning, strategic patience, and moral reflection, he discovered that revenge is most powerful when it is measured, dignified, and rooted in truth rather than malice. The act of reclaiming his dignity without causing unnecessary harm had transformed the raw energy of anger into a quiet, enduring sense of empowerment. Vanessa, too, seemed changed. She approached interactions with Jonathan more thoughtfully, aware of the subtleties of her own behavior and the impact of her words. While pride would naturally make immediate acknowledgement uncomfortable, her demeanor reflected introspection, humility, and an understanding that casual dismissiveness can have far-reaching consequences. Jonathan recognized that her growth was a product not of coercion or humiliation, but of witnessing quiet authority, competence, and moral clarity, qualities that command respect more effectively than confrontation ever could. Jonathan reflected frequently on the journey from the funeral to this point. The emotional landscape had been treacherous, grief intertwined with anger, humiliation mingled with longing for acknowledgement, and the temptation for revenge loomed at every turn. Yet by channeling his emotions constructively, he had achieved a resolution that preserved his integrity, strengthened his self-respect, and created a subtle but undeniable impact. The experience reinforced a profound principle: true power lies not in retaliation, but in maintaining dignity, asserting truth, and allowing the natural consequences of actions to unfold. Months later, Jonathan found himself revisiting memories of the funeral, the moment of mockery, and the careful planning that had followed. He no longer felt the sting of humiliation, nor the restless urge for revenge. Instead, he felt a quiet sense of mastery over his own emotional responses, the ability to navigate complex interpersonal dynamics with intelligence, patience, and ethical clarity. He realized that personal empowerment does not come from causing others discomfort, but from understanding oneself, making deliberate choices, and allowing integrity to guide every action. Vanessa, when she finally spoke about the incident in private conversation, did so with honesty and reflection. She admitted the carelessness of her words, the unintentional harm caused, and the lessons she had learned about judgment, assumptions, and humility. Jonathan listened without judgment, understanding that reconciliation does not require erasing past wrongs, but acknowledging them with maturity, empathy, and respect for shared history. This period of reflection and subtle reconciliation marked a transformation not only in their relationship but also in Jonathan's understanding of human behavior. He recognized that the desire for revenge, while natural, can be redirected into constructive, morally grounded actions that restore balance and dignity. He saw that words, once spoken, cannot be taken back, but the consequences of those words can be addressed thoughtfully, allowing growth and understanding to emerge. The moral lesson crystallized clearly: revenge in its raw form often perpetuates pain, resentment, and conflict. By contrast, measured action, guided by integrity, patience, and clarity of purpose, achieves a resolution that is enduring, constructive, and psychologically empowering. Jonathan had reclaimed his narrative, asserted his worth, and allowed the natural consequences of arrogance and mockery to unfold, all without sacrificing his principles or causing unnecessary harm. As he walked through the quiet streets on an autumn afternoon, Jonathan reflected on the journey from grief to empowerment, from humiliation to quiet triumph. The sting of mockery at his mother's funeral had served as a catalyst, prompting reflection, strategic action, and moral growth. He understood now that the most satisfying form of vindication is not found in punishing others, but in demonstrating competence, integrity, and dignity, qualities that speak louder than words, gestures, or retaliation ever could. Vanessa's eventual acknowledgement, however subtle, reinforced the lesson. True understanding and respect emerge not through coercion or humiliation, but through witnessing quiet strength, ethical clarity, and consistent demonstration of value. The dynamic between them, once fractured by pride and thoughtlessness, evolved into one of cautious respect, tempered awareness, and reflective growth. Jonathan felt a profound sense of closure. The emotional turmoil that had once threatened to dominate his thoughts was now replaced by balance, perspective, and the quiet satisfaction of having navigated a complex, morally charged situation with intelligence and dignity. He had faced grief, insult, and the temptation for revenge, and emerged not only intact, but empowered, wise, and morally grounded. In the final analysis, Jonathan Reid understood the enduring truth: the most powerful response to mockery, insult, or injustice is not retaliation, but the combination of patience, preparation, and principled action. By allowing the truth to speak for itself, he achieved a resolution that transcended momentary satisfaction, creating a lasting impact grounded in integrity, self-respect, and moral clarity. The journey from humiliation to empowerment, from grief to reconciliation, had imparted lessons that would guide him for the rest of his life, and in doing so, transformed what could have been a story of revenge into a story of wisdom, dignity, and enduring human growth.